The atmosphere in the room was charged with anticipation as Carolina Leavitt and Morgan Freeman faced each other, poised for a debate that was bound to be both electrifying and deeply philosophical. The stakes were high, the subject matter urgent, and the clash of perspectives inevitable. On one side, Carolina Leavitt embodied the growing movement of environmental activism, driven by an unshakable belief that humanity was on the brink of irreversible catastrophe. On the other, Morgan Freeman, the voice of reason, wisdom, and historical perspective, refused to succumb to the widespread panic that had consumed much of the modern discourse. The question at hand was simple, yet colossal in scope. Is the planet truly in imminent danger? Or is this another chapter in Earth's long history of adaptation and transformation? Carolina wasted no time in making her position clear. Her voice was steady but laced with urgency, her eyes burning with the conviction of someone who had spent years immersed in climate research and policy discussions. She leaned forward, her gaze locked onto Freeman as she laid out her argument with precision. Mr. Freeman, your documentary Life on Our Planet is undoubtedly a cinematic masterpiece, but there is something deeply troubling about the message it conveys. While it acknowledges the mass extinctions of the past, it seems to downplay the very real and unprecedented crisis we are facing today. Unlike previous extinction events, which were caused by natural forces beyond human control, this time, we are the architects of our own destruction. Our reckless industrialization, our insatiable appetite for fossil fuels, and our relentless deforestation are pushing the planet to a breaking point. The warnings from the scientific community could not be clearer. If we do not act now, the consequences will be catastrophic. Morgan Freeman, ever composed, let a brief silence settle between them. There was something about his demeanor that commanded attention. Not arrogance, not dismissal, but the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the world change time and time again. He leaned back slightly, interlocking his fingers as if weighing his words carefully before delivering them. Carolina, I respect your passion, and I do not deny that humanity has an impact on the environment. But let's take a step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. The Earth is not as fragile as we like to believe. It has endured asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes, and ice ages that wiped out entire species long before human beings ever set foot on it. And yet here we are. Life is incredibly resilient. It always finds a way. Carolina's expression hardened. She had expected this response, the classic argument that Earth had faced worse and survived. But she wasn't about to let it go unchallenged. Mr. Freeman, with all due respect, you're ignoring a fundamental difference. Yes, the Earth has undergone dramatic shifts before, but those changes occurred over thousands, sometimes millions, of years. What we are seeing today is happening at an unprecedented rate, fueled by human activities that are accelerating the process beyond anything the natural world can adapt to. Ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising, wildfires are intensifying, and species are disappearing faster than at any point in recorded history. We are not giving nature a chance to recover. Freeman nodded slowly, acknowledging the concern, yet his expression remained unshaken. You speak of urgency, Carolina, and I understand why. But let's talk about how that urgency is being used. Fear has become a currency in today's discourse. We are told that unless we take extreme action, imposing aggressive carbon taxes, banning entire industries, even reducing meat consumption on a global scale, our civilization will collapse. Yet, have you noticed who these policies tend to affect the most? It's never the elites who propose them. It's the working-class families who can't afford higher energy prices, the farmers who struggle to maintain their livelihoods, the developing nations that are being told they cannot industrialize because it's bad for the planet. That is the real catastrophe, the one that is happening in the name of saving the world. Carolina let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. That is a common mischaracterization. No one is saying we should halt progress or leave people behind. But we have to recognize that our current model of consumption is unsustainable. You talk about adaptation, but adaptation takes time that we don't have. What happens when food shortages become widespread, when millions are displaced due to rising sea levels, when ecosystems collapse beyond recovery. We are heading toward a future of unimaginable suffering if we do not act decisively. Freeman's lips curved into a slight knowing smirk. And what exactly are we defining as acting decisively? Who gets to decide what sacrifices must be made and by whom? Let's take a real-world example. In Sri Lanka, the government banned chemical fertilizers to embrace green agriculture. What happened? Crop yields plummeted, food shortages spread, and the economy collapsed. The people who suffered the most weren't the politicians or the environmental activists. It was the farmers, the laborers, the everyday citizens who were forced to bear the burden of policies that sounded good on paper, but failed in practice. Idealism without pragmatism is dangerous. Carolina's frustration was evident. She was not just debating Freeman, she was debating a mindset that, to her, represented complacency in the face of an existential crisis. So what's your alternative? Just let things take their course? Watch the world burn and hope for the best? That seems reckless, Mr. Freeman. Freeman sighed, his voice as steady as ever. I'm saying we need a balanced approach. Innovation, not hysteria, will lead us forward. Fear is a powerful tool, but it should never be the foundation of policy. We should be investing in new technologies, in cleaner energy sources that do not cripple economies, in strategies that uplift people rather than restrict them. The problem is, too many in power prefer to use fear as a means of control rather than seeking real, sustainable solutions. If you want to change the world, Carolina, you don't do it by making people afraid. You do it by empowering them. Carolina clenched her jaw, the tension palpable in the air. Fear is necessary when people refuse to listen. When the stakes are this high, waiting for people to wake up is not an option. We don't have time for slow, incremental change. Morgan Freeman simply nodded, his expression unreadable. That's what they said 30 years ago, Carolina. And yet here we are. The debate was far from over, but in that moment, the contrast between them had never been clearer. One saw humanity as a force of destruction that needed to be reined in before it was too late. The other saw it as an adaptable species, capable of finding solutions without succumbing to fear. As the conversation continued, the real question emerged. Not just about the fate of the planet, but about the nature of humanity itself. Are we the problem, or are we the solution? The answer, it seemed, would define the course of history. The debate took a sharp turn as the discussion moved away from environmental concerns and into the realm of cultural representation. The weight of history, progress, and lingering injustices now hung in the air. Carolina Leavitt, unwavering in her convictions, knew that this part of the conversation would be no less contentious than the last. She straightened her posture, her voice firm but composed, determined to challenge what she saw as a dangerous dismissal of systemic inequality. Morgan, let's talk about something you've been vocal about in the past: racism in Hollywood. You've claimed before that there is no race problem in the industry. But let's be honest here. For decades, Hollywood marginalized black actors, forcing them into stereotypical roles, limiting their opportunities, and failing to tell their stories authentically. Even now, while progress has been made, black filmmakers and actors still face barriers. Do you truly believe that racism in Hollywood is a thing of the past? Or are you simply choosing not to see it? Morgan Freeman exhaled slowly, shaking his head ever so slightly. Not in dismissal, but in measured thought. Carolina, let's start with the facts. Has Hollywood had a history of typecasting black actors? Absolutely. Were black stories underrepresented for a long time? No doubt. But to say that Hollywood today is still shackled by racism is to ignore the massive strides that have been made. Look around you. Films with black leads are dominating the box office. Black directors are making Oscar-winning films, and streaming platforms are actively pushing for diversity in storytelling. Hollywood isn't racist, it's profit-driven, and right now diversity sells. Carolina's brows furrowed, unsatisfied with the response. So you're saying the progress we've made is purely financial? That Hollywood only cares about representation because it makes money? Doesn't that prove that the industry still sees black actors as commodities rather than as artists deserving of equal footing? Freeman smirked slightly, recognizing the rhetorical trap being laid before him, but he was not one to be caught off guard. Carolina, let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. Hollywood only cares about one color, green. Money has always been the driving force behind the industry. Look back at the 1970s when Cotton Comes to Harlem was released. It was a huge success, and suddenly, Hollywood saw that black-led films could be profitable. The same thing happened when Black Panther shattered records. The film industry responds to demand, not ideology. And let's be real, if Hollywood were truly racist, why would it invest in black-led films, black producers, and black-led production companies? The fact that these projects exist and succeed proves that we're not dealing with a system that is actively oppressing black talent. The doors are open. But here's the real question. Are we walking through them, or are we standing outside, complaining that they should be wider? Carolina wasn't ready to back down. But that's exactly the issue, Morgan. It's not just about whether a few black actors and directors find success. It's about the broader system that still undervalues black voices. How many times do black stories get sidelined unless they fit into a specific narrative that Hollywood deems marketable? How often are black actors told they can only play roles tied to trauma, struggle, or oppression? The industry may be more inclusive, but the underlying structures haven't changed. Freeman's gaze held steady, his tone unwavering. Carolina, we have to ask ourselves, do we want real progress, or do we want to keep chasing a narrative of victimhood? No one is stopping black filmmakers from telling their own stories. If mainstream Hollywood isn't producing the stories you want to see, make them yourself. That's exactly what independent filmmakers have been doing for decades. The technology exists, the platforms exist, the audience exists. Complaining that the system isn't perfect doesn't move us forward. Action does. Carolina's lips parted as if to interject, but Freeman wasn't finished. His voice took on a weightier tone, one that carried the depth of personal experience. I've been in this industry for decades, and I have seen what real barriers look like. I remember when the only black characters you'd see in films were servants or criminals. And yes, that was wrong. But that isn't the world we live in anymore. If you want to see more black stories, support black creators. If you want more, black executives, start businesses. The idea that we are still shackled by an invisible system is an illusion that does more harm than good. It keeps us looking backward instead of forward. Carolina took a deep breath, shaking her head slightly. But what about the next generation? What message does it send to young black kids when they see that the biggest movies about their history are always about suffering, about slavery, oppression, and discrimination? Doesn't that reinforce the idea that black identity is tied to pain rather than triumph? Freeman nodded thoughtfully, taking in her words before responding. That is a fair question. And yes, I do think Hollywood tends to lean heavily into stories of black pain, because pain sells. But that doesn't mean we have to accept that as the only narrative. We need more stories about black success, about black joy, about black innovation. And guess what? They exist. The problem is that too many people are still focused on waiting for Hollywood to change instead of changing it themselves. Carolina's frustration was evident, but there was also something else. Perhaps a flicker of understanding, or at the very least, the realization that she was speaking to a man who had lived through the very struggles she was arguing about. She took a moment, choosing her words carefully. So you're saying the responsibility is on us, not the system? Freeman's response was immediate, but not dismissive. I'm saying the system will never change as fast as we want it to. So why should we wait for it? Change is in our hands. Always has been. Always will be. For a brief moment, the room fell into silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that signified defeat or victory. It was the silence of contemplation, of perspectives colliding, of ideas intertwining in the minds, of those who had just witnessed an exchange that was not about winning or losing, but about seeing the world through a different lens. The debate was far from over. But in that moment, it was clear that this conversation was no longer just about Hollywood. It was about something much deeper. It was about agency. It was about who controls the narrative. And most of all, it was about whether the greatest barrier to progress was truly an external force, or whether it was in fact the way we choose to see ourselves. The next topic loomed in the distance like a storm on the horizon, promising another battle of ideology, another confrontation between urgency and patience, between intervention and self-reliance. If this was only the beginning, the real fight was yet to come. The debate took a sharp turn as the focus shifted to government intervention. Carolina Leavitt, unwavering in her belief that immediate action was necessary, pressed forward. Mr. Freeman, the time for debate is over. Scientists have been warning us for decades, and yet emissions continue to rise. We need aggressive policies, strict carbon regulations, taxes on polluters, and limits on industrial expansion. People won't change unless they're forced to. Governments must take the lead before it's too late. Morgan Freeman remained composed, his voice steady. Carolina, when has government intervention ever been free of consequences? Every time leaders claim they need to save us, they impose policies that hurt the working class the most. Carbon. Taxes won't affect billionaires. They'll affect families struggling to afford basic utilities. Banning industries won't punish politicians. It will destroy small businesses and jobs. Fear is being used as a tool to justify control, and history has shown us how dangerous that can be. Carolina leaned in, frustration in her eyes. Fear is necessary when people refuse to act. Do you think corporations would have ever reduced pollution voluntarily? No. It took strict regulations to clean the air and water. The free market won't fix this. Governments have to. Freeman sighed, shaking his head. And who do you trust to make those decisions? Governments have mismanaged economies, botched disaster responses, and left people suffering in the name of progress. Look at Sri Lanka. They banned chemical fertilizers to go green overnight, and their entire agricultural system collapsed. People starved. That's what happens when idealism overrides reality. Carolina crossed her arms. That was bad execution, not a bad idea. With the right planning and education, sustainable transitions can work. Freeman met her gaze, his voice unwavering. The moment you start deciding how people must live, what they can eat, how they can travel, what businesses they can run, you open the door to authoritarian overreach. Real change doesn't come from force, it comes from innovation and choice. The moment we forget that, we repeat the mistakes of history. A heavy silence followed. The debate was no longer just about climate policies. It was about power, control, and whether forcing people to change in the name of progress was truly justified. And as the conversation moved forward, an even more polarizing topic awaited, ready to challenge the very foundation of personal freedom and identity. The debate had reached its most explosive point yet. What began as a discussion about climate and government intervention had now turned into a confrontation about race, identity, and personal responsibility. The tension in the room was thick, the weight of history pressing down on both speakers. Carolina Leavitt, passionate and unwavering, was ready to challenge what she saw as a dismissive attitude toward systemic racism. But Morgan Freeman, armed with decades of experience and a lifetime of perspective, was not one to back down. Carolina's voice was sharp, cutting through the air with conviction. Mr. Freeman, you've said before that you don't believe in systemic racism, that it's not an issue in America anymore. But how can you say that when Black communities still suffer from generational poverty, when police brutality disproportionately affects Black people, and when politicians are actively trying to erase Black history from schools? Denying racism doesn't make it disappear. We need policies, affirmative action, reparations, criminal justice reform, to correct the injustices that still exist today. Freeman let out a slow breath, his eyes steady. Carolina, I never said racism doesn't exist. Of course it does. But I refuse to accept this idea that Black people are permanently victims of a system designed to keep them down. I've lived long enough to see real barriers. I remember when Black actors could only play servants in Hollywood. I remember when opportunities were truly scarce. But that is not the world we live in today. The biggest obstacle facing Black communities now is not racism. It's the belief that racism is an unbreakable chain that determines our future. Carolina shook her head, frustration flashing across her face. That's easy for you to say, Mr. Freeman. You're successful. You made it. But not everyone has the same opportunities. Not every Black child grows up with the same privileges. The system is still built to favor white people. Freeman's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time his voice carried a sharper edge. Carolina, do you hear yourself? You are a white woman sitting here telling me, a Black man, that I don't understand racism, that I don't understand struggle, that I don't understand what it means to be Black in America. Do you not see the irony in that? Carolina hesitated for a fraction of a second, but she didn't back down. I'm not saying you don't understand, I'm saying you're ignoring the bigger picture. Racism is still deeply embedded in our institutions. It's not about individual success, it's about the collective struggle of an entire people. Freeman tilted his head, his next words deliberate. Carolina, let me ask you something. Are you racist? The question landed like a thunderclap. Carolina blinked, visibly caught off guard. What? No, of course not. Freeman leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. Then why do you insist on seeing Black people as helpless victims who need special treatment to succeed? Why do you believe that a Black child today is doomed before they even get a chance? That mindset is the most dangerous form of racism. There is the soft bigotry of low expectations. You don't fight racism by convincing people they can't win. You fight it by proving they can. Carolina clenched her jaw, searching for a response, but Freeman continued, his voice calm but firm. I have lived long enough to know that opportunity exists for those who seek it. I have seen Black doctors, Black CEOs, Black entrepreneurs rise, not because of government handouts, not because of policies that told them they were disadvantaged, but because they refused to be defined by their circumstances. The moment you convince a young Black man that the system is rigged against him, you've already taken away his most powerful weapon, his belief in himself. Carolina exhaled sharply. So you think racism is just a mindset? That if people just believe in themselves, they'll magically overcome generations of inequality? Freeman shook his head. I think personal responsibility is the key to success. I think blaming the system keeps people trapped in a cycle of inaction. I think waiting for politicians to fix your problems is the surest way to stay exactly where you are. The truth is the doors are open, but you have to walk through them. The room fell silent. The energy between them had shifted. This was no longer just a debate. It was a clash of worldviews, a fundamental disagreement on what it truly meant to overcome adversity. Carolina, still holding on to her convictions, spoke again, but this time her voice was quieter. I just want a world where Black people don't have to work twice as hard to get half as far. Freeman's gaze softened slightly. And I want a world where Black people don't believe they have to. Because the moment you believe in limits, they become real. The debate was over. But the conversation, that would last far beyond this moment.